Hey guys, tonight, we're heading back in time to the world of medieval castles. Those giant stone fortresses that look impressive until you remember they basically functioned like drafty prisons with plumbing problems. So, get comfortable, dim the lights, and settle in. Let's drift through the strange, fascinating, and occasionally disgusting world of medieval castles. The kind of places where rats had better housing rights than most servants. Let's start with a simple truth. Castles weren't built to be cozy, they were built to make people not want to visit. When you see those tall towers and heavy gates in a fantasy movie, it looks majestic. In real life, those places were cold, smoky, and smelled faintly of damp wool and questionable soup. But still, they were the heart of medieval power, symbols of wealth, authority, and the medieval obsession with who can build the bigger wall. The first thing most people don't realize is that castles started out as glorified dirt piles. The earliest ones, especially in 10th century Europe, were Martin-Bailey castles. Imagine a big mound of earth that's the motte topped with a wooden tower. Surrounded by a fenced-in courtyard, that's the bailey. If you were a Norman nobleman fresh off the boat in England after 1066, this was your starter pack. Some dirt, some wood, and a few terrified peasants to help you pile it up. They were cheap, fast, and easy to build. Basically the IKEA version of fortifications. Except, instead of struggling with an Allen wrench, you just needed about 500 serfs with shovels. And instead of a warranty, you got a promise that it would probably burn down in the next decade, which they often did. As you can imagine, wood wasn't ideal. Fires, sieges, weather, all not great for structural integrity. So by the 12th century, castle builders decided to upgrade to stone. This is when things started looking like what we picture today. Big grey walls, round towers, and enough space to house a small army and a larger ego. Stone castles were expensive, but they sent a clear message. I'm rich, I'm powerful, and I don't care that my main bedroom is colder than a crypt. Now, here's a fun fact. Castles weren't just for defense, they were also massive status symbols. Building one was basically medieval Instagram. Nobles would compete over who had the tallest keep, the deepest moat, or the most intimidating drawbridge. A big castle said, I'm important. A small one said, please don't invade me. And speaking of moats, let's clear up a myth. Most moats weren't full of crocodiles or monsters. They were full of mud, and sometimes sewage. The whole water-filled moat idea worked only in certain areas with good water flow. In most cases, it was just a deep, slimy ditch designed to make siege engines sink and attackers regret their life choices. Inside, life was far less glamorous than the outside suggested. The Great Hall, the central room of the castle, was where everything happened. Feasts, court hearings, gossip, maybe even the occasional drunken sword fight. It was smoky, noisy, and packed. The fireplace was enormous, but it didn't do much against the cold stone walls. People wore layers of wool not because it was fashionable, but because hypothermia was unfashionable. The lord and lady of the castle usually had a solar, which was their private chamber. Think of it as the medieval version of a VIP lounge, slightly warmer, slightly cleaner, but still kind of miserable. Furniture was scarce, bedding was lumpy, and everyone smelled like wet dog. Hygiene was, let's call it, optional. Bathing happened rarely, and when it did, it was a group event. If that sounds awkward, remember, this was a world before personal space was invented. One of the strangest things about castles was how multifunctional they were. They weren't just homes, they were fortresses, prisons, administrative centers, and storage units. A medieval lord could host a feast one day and torture a spy in the basement the next. Talk about open floor plans. And let's not forget toilets. The medieval solution was something called a garderobe. Picture a small stone room with a hole in the floor, usually built right into the outer wall. Waste dropped down into, you guessed it, the moat, or a pit below. The smell was so bad that people sometimes stored their clothes in the garderobe, believing the stench would keep moths away. In a way, it did. Moths, people, everything. Another oddity, castles weren't as isolated as we often think. They were buzzing little ecosystems with servants, cooks, blacksmiths, stable hands, priests, and even jesters. The lord might own the castle, but hundreds of people kept it running, and most of them lived in constant drafty discomfort. Winter in a castle was brutal. Fires burned all day, smoke filled the air, and frost crept across the walls. You didn't wake up in the morning, you defrosted. Despite all that, castles were centers of community life. The local peasants depended on them for protection, especially during raids or wars. When attackers approached, villagers would rush inside the walls, bringing livestock, carts, and anything portable. The result: instant medieval chaos. Imagine a mix of panic, mud, and mooing cows. The soundtrack of feudal safety. Let us float over to another little-known fact. Most medieval castles weren't as massive as you think. Hollywood loves to exaggerate. In reality, many were fairly compact, with only a few key rooms. Space was limited, and privacy was rare. Even high-ranking nobles shared sleeping quarters with servants, guards, or unlucky relatives. Curtains, not walls, divided areas. So if someone was snoring, coughing, or whispering secrets, everyone knew. And yet, despite the lack of comfort, people adored their castles. They were symbols of order in a chaotic world, where kings came and went, and plagues occasionally wiped out half your neighborhood. Behind those walls, you had protection, or at least the illusion of it. Architecturally, castles evolved fast. Early keeps were simple rectangles, then came round towers stronger against siege weapons. Arrow slits appeared, narrow openings where defenders could fire arrows while staying protected. The design was both practical and terrifyingly efficient. Nothing says welcome like a row of slit-eyed walls, silently judging you from a distance. By the 13th century, castle design became an art form. Builders started experimenting with multiple walls, gatehouses, and murder holes. Those charming openings above the main gate used to pour boiling oil or stones onto attackers. The medieval equivalent of "please go away." And speaking of gates, the drawbridge wasn't just for show. It was an engineering marvel. Usually operated by chains and counterweights, it could be raised quickly during an attack, sealing off the entrance. Some castles even had double drawbridges, because why not double down on paranoia? But let's be honest, for all their defenses, castles weren't invincible. Gunpowder eventually changed everything. By the late 1400s, cannons made those thick stone walls look like brittle cookie crust. Once artillery arrived, the age of castles started to fade. But for a few centuries, they ruled the landscape, symbols of human stubbornness, craftsmanship, and the eternal desire to say, "This is mine." Alright, let's float to our next bit, the strange, sometimes absurd lives of the people who actually lived inside these stone beasts. Let's settle in and move deeper into the castle, past the gates, across the courtyard, and into the odd rhythm of daily life inside. Because once you step beyond those impressive stone walls, things start to feel less like a royal fortress and more like a noisy, medieval sitcom with bad heating. Every day in a castle started early, not because people were particularly motivated, but because sunlight was the only reliable clock. When the first light hit the courtyard, the servants were already up, stoking fires, hauling water, cleaning chamber pots, and pretending to enjoy it. Meanwhile, the lord and lady would wake up a little later, usually after being dressed by their attendants. Yes, dressed, because apparently pulling on your own hose and tunic was considered beneath someone who owned land. Breakfast wasn't much. Maybe some bread, ale, and cheese, a meal designed less to satisfy hunger and more to prevent fainting before noon. Coffee didn't exist, which explains why everyone in medieval portraits looked so tired. After breakfast, the castle buzzed with routine. Guards changed posts, maids scrubbed floors, cooks shouted in the kitchen, and somewhere in the background, a stable boy stepped in something unfortunate. The kitchen itself was a world of chaos. Massive fireplaces roared all day, filling the air with smoke and the smell of roasting meat. Meals were prepared in enormous quantities, not just for the noble family, but for dozens of guests, servants, and hangers-on. Food safety was not exactly a science yet, so if the meat smelled questionable, they'd just add more spices. Medieval seasoning philosophy was basically bury it in pepper and pray. Dinner, or the main feast of the day, was the social highlight. The great hall filled with the sound of chatter, clinking goblets, and probably a few coughing fits. The lord and lady sat on a raised platform, a few symbolic inches higher than everyone else. This wasn't for comfort, it was for hierarchy. Because even at dinner, medieval society had levels. Literally, food was served in courses, often on trenchers, thick slabs of stale bread that doubled as plates. When you finished, you didn't eat the trencher. It went to the poor, who got to enjoy the flavor of everyone's leftovers. Sharing was caring, medieval style. Table manners were flexible. Forks existed but were seen as effeminate at first, so most people just used knives, spoons, or fingers. Napkins weren't always available either. Guests often wiped their hands on the tablecloth or their neighbor's sleeve, depending on how friendly they were feeling, which makes you think twice about wanting to attend a royal banquet. Drinks were simpler: ale, wine, and more ale. Water wasn't trusted for good reason, so even children drank weak beer. The result was a population that was slightly tipsy, slightly malnourished, and very good at singing questionable songs after dinner. And when the meal ended, entertainment began. Minstrels, jesters, and storytellers wandered from castle to castle, performing for food or coin. Their jokes were crude, their songs long, and their audiences easily distracted. A good jester wasn't just funny, he was politically savvy. He could make fun of the Lord lightly, without ending up in the dungeon. The line between humor and treason was very thin. Now, let's drift upstairs, into the private chambers. These rooms were supposed to be more comfortable, but that's a generous description. Mattresses were stuffed with straw, feathers if you were lucky, and shared with insects who paid no rent. Curtains around beds were meant for warmth and privacy, but mostly trapped the smell of unwashed humans. Lighting came from candles, which smoked and dripped everywhere, leaving the scent of melted tallow or beef fat hanging in the air. Nothing says luxury like sleeping in a flickering haze of animal grease. Clothing was another layer of medieval weirdness. Everyone wore wool because it was warm, durable, and available. Linen was for undergarments, and silk was for the rich. Getting dressed meant layering several pieces in precise order, each tied or pinned together. It could take a while, especially if you were trying to look respectable. And if you were a lady of status, good luck, you basically lived in a wearable puzzle. Bathing, as you might expect, was rare. When it happened, it was an event. The wooden tub would be dragged into the chamber, filled with water from the kitchen, and maybe scented with herbs. The Lord bathed first, then the lady, then the children, then the servants. Same water. Hygiene trickled down the social ladder, literally. Some castles had permanent bathhouses, but they were mostly for show. People believed bathing too often could make you sick. Ironically, not bathing definitely did. Let's wander down to the servants' quarters. They lived close to their work, near the kitchens, stables, or gatehouses. Rooms were cramped, dark, and shared. Privacy was non-existent. Sleep came in short bursts, between chores, and yet, being a servant in a castle wasn't the worst job available. You were inside, fed, and theoretically protected from raiders. Outside, peasants had it far rougher. At least castle servants got to complain indoors. Speaking of protection, let's talk about castle defenses, the medieval version of home security. Guards patrolled the walls day and night, peering through arrow slits and checking gates. Bells or horns would sound if danger approached, and everyone had a role during a siege. The Lord directed, the soldiers fought, and everyone else panicked professionally. A siege could last weeks or months. Attackers surrounded the castle, cutting off supplies, hoping hunger would do the work. Defenders dumped boiling oil, shot arrows, or hurled rocks from the battlements. Occasionally, they'd throw something more personal, like dead animals, to spread disease. It was psychological warfare with bonus plague. Inside, life during a siege became miserable fast. Food ran low, water turned foul, and tempers flared. But castles were built for endurance. They had wells, storerooms, and secret passages, though not nearly as many as movies suggest. Most secret tunnels were just escape routes for the Lord, not the staff, because of course they were. Now, when the fighting ended and peace returned, castles became administrative hubs again. The Lord would hold court, settle disputes, collect taxes, and remind everyone that he technically owned their souls. Clerks and scribes kept records, often on parchment, made from animal skin. So yes, medieval paperwork was literally made of cows. Bureaucracy has always been a bit absurd. Religion touched everything too. Most castles had chapels, where prayers were said daily. Lords liked to be seen as pious, even if their daily activities included extortion and mild violence. Priests blessed meals, lands, and occasionally weapons, because divine approval apparently improved aim. Sundays were for rest, though in a castle that usually meant less shouting and slightly better bread. As night fell, torches and candles flickered through the corridors. Doors were barred, gates locked, and watchmen took their posts. Inside, the castle went quiet, mostly. Mice scurried, dogs barked, and somewhere, someone was still complaining about the draft. The thick stone walls trapped heat poorly, so people slept close together, layered in blankets, hoping the fire didn't go out before dawn. Outside, the world was dark and dangerous. Wolves roamed the forests, thieves lurked on the roads, and distant wars never really stopped. But inside those cold walls, life went on. Births, deaths, feasts, and famines, all unfolding within the same echoing chambers. Every stone had seen centuries of human absurdity and stubbornness, layered like dust. Let's float onward to another side of castle life, the strange social rules, power games, and romantic disasters that made these stone fortresses feel less like homes and more like gilded prisons. All right, let's ease back in. The fires are low, the halls are quiet, and it's time to explore the part of castle life everyone secretly wants to know about. The relationships, politics, and messy personal drama that played out behind all that stone and ceremony. Because under the chainmail and tapestries, these people were just people, petty, jealous, and occasionally absurd. Marriage in the medieval world wasn't exactly romantic. For nobles, it was a business contract, signed in candlelight and sealed with alliances, not affection. The lord of the castle might marry a teenage bride from another family, not because she was charming, but because her dowry included a few acres and a politically useful uncle. Love wasn't required, cooperation was. And if you were lucky, your new spouse didn't actively despise you. The wedding itself was usually held right there in the castle's great hall, surrounded by feasting and awkward small talk between families who had been feuding for 3 generations. The priest would bless the union, the guests would cheer, and then everyone would immediately start drinking, because that's how you got through medieval small talk. After the ceremony came the bedding ritual, which is exactly what it sounds like. In many noble households, the couple was escorted to their chamber while the entire castle staff followed, singing, laughing, and occasionally offering unsolicited advice. Privacy wasn't just rare, it was suspicious. If you wanted to be left alone, people assumed you were plotting treason. And of course, these arranged marriages often went as well as you'd expect. Affairs were common, scandals frequent, and rumors constant. The lady of the castle might find herself drawn to a knight, the handsome, chivalrous type, who conveniently ignored the vows of chastity. Meanwhile, her husband might be more interested in hunting, politics, or, let's be honest, drinking. The result was a quiet, ongoing game of appearances, everyone pretending things were fine while the servants whispered about who was sneaking into whose chambers after dark. The servants, by the way, were the social media of the medieval world. They saw everything, heard everything, and passed it along faster than gossip spreads at a royal banquet. A careless word could destroy reputations. But, to be fair, everyone's reputation was already halfway ruined by rumor anyway. Let's drift over to power and politics, because every castle was a microcosm of medieval ambition. The lord wasn't just a noble lounging in fur robes. He was a manager, judge, and part-time warlord. He ruled his domain like a franchise owner of feudalism. Taxes came in, soldiers went out, and the paperwork never stopped. Behind the banners and armor, castle life was mostly about logistics, feeding people, fixing walls, and making sure the peasants didn't revolt before harvest season. The lady of the castle, on the other hand, had her own authority, and it was more powerful than many realize. When her husband was away, which was often, because medieval men loved a good war, she ran the place. She oversaw food supplies, servants, discipline, and diplomacy. Some ladies were gentle administrators, others ruled with the intensity of a caffeinated general. Records show that many were far more competent than their husbands. Of course, history rarely gave them credit. Now, because people can't resist being dramatic, castle life was also filled with intrigue. Letters sealed with wax, messengers galloping through storms, secret meetings in cold corridors. It was basically the medieval version of a political thriller, except everyone spoke Latin and wore pointy shoes. Betrayals happened constantly. Cousins plotted against cousins. Lords schemed for titles. Even priests got involved, because everyone liked a bit of power. And through all this plotting, the physical castle itself shaped behavior. The narrow staircases, thick doors, and hidden alcoves made eavesdropping an art form. If walls could talk, they'd mostly say, "You won't believe what I just heard in the solar." Now, let's talk about romance, or whatever passed for it, in a world where bathing was seasonal. Courtly love, The poetic idea of noble romance blossomed in castles during the 12th century. Troubadours sang about unattainable ladies, gallant knights pledged eternal devotion, and everyone pretended it was deeply meaningful. In reality, most of these romances were emotional side projects between married nobles who were bored and had too much time indoors. It was socially acceptable flirting, dressed up in poetry. Still, it gave rise to a weird cultural paradox. Knights were supposed to be pious and loyal, yet also hopelessly in love with women they couldn't have. It's like medieval emotional masochism. Poems about noble suffering filled the halls, and some men took it too seriously, fainting, fasting, or writing dramatic odes about a lady's smile, which she probably didn't even notice. Let us drift down from the lofty halls to the darker corners of castle life, the places where things weren't poetic at all. Dungeons, for example, weren't nearly as dramatic as we imagine. Most castles didn't have them, at least not in the movie sense. Prisoners were usually kept in upper rooms or cellars. Real torture chambers were rare and mostly symbolic, but when punishment did happen, it was unpleasant enough to discourage repeat offenses. The medieval justice system didn't believe in second chances. Then there was superstition, a huge part of daily life. People believed in curses, omens, and saints who could fix anything from broken legs to bad weather. The castle chapel was the spiritual hub, filled with relics, bits of bone, cloth, or wood supposedly linked to holy figures. Some were real, most were not. But faith, like architecture, was about reassurance, not proof. Magic and folklore slipped in too. People hung charms over doors to ward off evil spirits. Knights wore talismans under their armor for luck. Even the most rational lords secretly consulted astrologers before big decisions. The same man who'd order a siege might also ask, is Mercury in retrograde? At night, the castle took on an entirely different atmosphere. Candlelight flickered on stone walls, and long corridors echoed with strange sounds, wind, rats, or maybe the ghosts of old inhabitants who refused to leave. Every castle had ghost stories. Usually, they involved a betrayed lover, a murdered servant, or a headless knight doomed to wander the halls forever. And honestly, after a few nights of bad sleep and too much ale, it was easy to believe them. Despite the gossip, tension, and drafty discomfort, castle life had its comforts. If you were high-born, feasts, music, hunting, falconry, and endless opportunities to complain about the peasants. The nobles saw themselves as chosen, ordained by God to rule, even if most couldn't manage their own kitchens without help. It was a strange balance of privilege and paranoia. Every castle was both a fortress and a cage, protecting its inhabitants from the world outside, while slowly isolating them within. Let's float toward one last layer of this world, the decline of the castle era. Because eventually, even the thickest walls couldn't hold back progress. Let's take a slow walk out of the Great Hall now, past the tapestries, down the spiral stairs, and out into the changing world beyond the castle walls. Because, as time rolled on, those towering fortresses that once ruled the landscape started to fade into something else entirely. Relics of a bygone era. Impressive but outdated. Like medieval mansions, nobody wanted to heat anymore. By the 14th and 15th centuries, castles were starting to lose their edge. Literally, gunpowder arrived, and with it came cannons, the loud, smoky end to centuries of stone-based confidence. All those thick walls that had shrugged off arrows and battering rams suddenly crumbled under a few rounds of heavy artillery. It was a rude awakening for Europe's nobility. Imagine spending your whole fortune on impenetrable walls, only to watch them collapse before lunch. That's what gunpowder did to the medieval ego. But technology wasn't the only reason castles declined. The entire concept of medieval warfare changed. Armies got bigger, sieges got shorter, and politics got complicated. Instead of local lords fighting over muddy fields, kings now commanded national forces. Power centralized, bureaucracy bloomed, and castles, once the symbols of feudal independence, became a little embarrassing old-school status symbols in an increasingly modern world. Some nobles tried to adapt. They reinforced their castles with thicker walls, lower profiles, and round bastions designed to deflect cannonballs. Others gave up entirely and built something new, the country manor. Less fortress, more comfort. Because if no one was attacking you anymore, why keep living in a drafty stone bunker? The Renaissance was calling, and it had glass windows and better furniture. Of course, not everyone could afford to remodel. Many castles simply fell into disrepair. Without constant maintenance, stone walls cracked, roofs caved in, and ivy took over. By the 16th century, England and France were dotted with romantic ruins, crumbling towers that poets later adored but their former owners probably didn't. Abandoned castles became landmarks, ghost stories, and occasionally convenient quarries. A surprising number of farmhouses were built from recycled castle stone. So yes, your medieval living room might once have been part of a royal toilet wall. Still, a few castles survived by evolving. They turned into administrative centers, prisons, armories, or garrisons. The Tower of London, for example, transitioned from royal palace to terrifying jail, to mildly overhyped tourist attraction. Others, like Windsor, managed to stay in royal hands and gradually turned into palatial residences, proof that if you hang on long enough, even a fortress can reinvent itself as luxury real estate. Meanwhile, in continental Europe, new kinds of fortifications emerged, sleek, angular star forts, designed for the age of gunpowder. These places looked nothing like the romantic castles of old. No towers, no turrets, no moats full of questionable water. Just low, geometric walls built for function, not Instagram. The medieval aesthetic had officially gone out of fashion. But while the practical age of castles ended, their legend only grew. During the 18th and 19th centuries, people got nostalgic. Writers, painters, and travelers romanticized ruins as symbols of lost grandeur. Poets wandered through overgrown courtyards, sighing about the passage of time. Architects even started building fake castles, follies. They called them for rich clients who wanted the vibe without the draft. Nothing says wealth like pretending your new house is a crumbling ruin. In that same era, Gothic revival architecture brought the castle look roaring back. Pointed arches, battlements, and towers started showing up on everything from mansions to public buildings. People wanted the romance of the past, not the reality. It's easy to love castles when you don't have to live in one. Even today, the fascination lingers. Castles appear in movies, video games, and every tourist brochure that needs something historically come. But the real medieval castles, the ones that echoed with boots, clanging armor, and endless cold, tell a quieter story. They weren't built for magic or mystery. They were built for survival, control, and fear. The beauty we see now is accidental, the product of decay, not design. Let's drift a bit closer to what life was like near the end, when castle owners were desperately trying to keep up with changing times. Inside those fading halls, things must have felt strange. The feasts were smaller, the servants fewer, the banners faded, and the songs stopped echoing so loudly. Some castles turned into family estates, others into ruins before the family line even ended. A few lords went bankrupt trying to maintain their ancestral homes, sinking into debt as their once mighty walls literally crumbled around them. There's something quietly tragic about that, the sound of history wearing itself out. And yet, castles never truly disappeared. Villagers built houses at their bases, towns grew around them, and legends filled the gaps. A ruined castle became a convenient reminder of better days, even for people whose ancestors probably served soup in those better days. The myth became cleaner than the reality ever was. Let's pause for a moment and picture one of those ruins today, standing on a lonely hill, with grass pushing up through the old courtyard stones. A few walls still rise, jagged against the sky. The wind slips through broken windows, whispering through stairwells that once rang with footsteps. Somewhere deep inside, the ghosts of old routines still linger. The clang of armor, the clatter of pots, a laugh cut short by time. It's haunting, but peaceful history finally exhaling. It's strange how human history keeps circling back to its own ruins. The same walls that once symbolized domination now symbolize imagination. We look at castles and see romance, not conquest. We imagine princesses, not tax collectors. But maybe that's what ruins are for, to let us rewrite the story without the discomfort. Still, behind every surviving castle lies 1,000 forgotten details. The servants who froze in the kitchens, the masons who built walls no one remembers, the women who ran estates when their husbands vanished into war. They're the ones who actually made those cold fortresses livable, or at least bearable. Let's end tonight's wandering with that thought. Castles were never just stone and mortar. They were living organisms filled with noise, work, smells, laughter, fear, and endless routine. And though the people are long gone, The walls remember. They always do. So next time you see a castle, try to picture it not as a monument, but as a home, a place of smoky fires, drafty halls, tired servants, and stubborn lords convinced their walls would last forever. Most didn't, but their stories did. Alright, that's where we'll leave it tonight. Hey, again, if you're still awake, congratulations, you've survived centuries of cold stone walls, drafty towers, and an alarming amount of moat talk. We're now drifting into the twilight of the Castle Age, that strange in-between time when knights were turning into courtiers, and castles were turning into Instagrammable ruins. Several centuries early. Let's start with the 15th century. Gunpowder had arrived, and castles did not take the news well. See, for hundreds of years, the big flex was "look how thick my walls are." Then, one day, someone showed up with a cannon and said, "Cool wall, watch this." The age of tall towers was over, and the age of short, squat fortresses began. It was like castles were going through a midlife crisis, cutting down their towers, broadening their bases, and insisting they were still relevant. The French, as usual, leaned into this architectural drama. In the Loire Valley, old fortresses were reimagined as chateaux, elegant, decorative, and entirely useless for defending anything. They still had moats, but more for the aesthetic. The only thing they were defending was the owner's ego. Meanwhile, in England, castles started to fall into two categories, either royal showpieces like Windsor, or sad, abandoned piles of moss. The local peasants usually raided them for building materials. So if you ever see a cute village cottage with an oddly medieval window, congrats, that's probably stolen from a castle ruin. Let's not forget the ghosts though. You can talk about medieval castles without talking about the parade of alleged spectres haunting their corridors. Almost every castle in Britain claims to have a lady in white. She's usually described as tragic, ethereal, and slightly transparent. Basically the medieval version of a sad There's also always a headless knight somewhere, wandering around looking for his own plot relevance. Historians, of course, point out that none of this is documented. But then again, no historian has ever spent a night alone in a freezing stone keep, with a candle guttering in the dark. So, maybe another fun fact. Castles were loud. We think of them as peaceful and echoing, but imagine hundreds of servants, soldiers, and livestock all packed inside the courtyard. Add blacksmiths hammering, dogs barking, and someone constantly shouting, "Close the gate." The place was more chaotic than cozy. The Lord's private chamber was supposed to be an escape, but it was still within earshot of everything. Privacy didn't really exist until much later. Even the king had people sleeping in his room. They were called grooms of the bedchamber. Yes, that was a real job. And yes, it's exactly as awkward as it sounds. As the centuries rolled on, castles stopped being practical and started being romantic. Writers and artists of the 18th and 19th centuries fell in love with the idea of ruins, all ivy-covered, mysterious, and melancholy. They painted them, wrote poems about them, and occasionally bought the ruins to impress people. That's how you got the Gothic revival, a wave of wealthy people trying to live out their medieval fantasies, complete with fake battlements and pretend moats. It was all cosplay, just with more money and less taste. And today, we still can't quite let go of castles. They're in movies, video games, and every other fantasy franchise imaginable. We picture knights riding out at dawn, banners fluttering, and torches glowing through arrow slits. But in reality, they were smoky, cramped, and smelled faintly of damp hay and onions. Still, there's something weirdly comforting about them, these silent monuments to human stubbornness. Stone walls that survived wars, fires, and centuries of tourists asking where the bathrooms are. So if you ever visit one, take a quiet moment, touch the cold wall, listen to the wind through the arrow slits. Imagine all the people who once lived and died inside those same stones, the laughter, the arguments, the footsteps that echoed long before you got there. And then, maybe, thank your modern heating system. That's it for tonight's journey through the lives, walls, and mildly disappointing plumbing of medieval castles. Sleep well, my fellow insomniac historian. Tomorrow, we'll drift somewhere else in the past, hopefully with fewer rats and more privacy. If you're still here, you've officially outlasted the Middle Ages and most medieval architects. Let's ease into the final stretch. No battles, no sieges, just quiet reflections from a world that somehow still lingers in our imagination. You'd think castles would have faded away once cannons showed up, right? But instead, they got reborn, not as fortresses, but as fantasies. Even after they stopped being useful, people couldn't stop staring at them. They became symbols of power, nostalgia, or sometimes just the world's fanciest real estate ad, for I am richer than you. By the 1800s, the ruins of old castles had turned into destinations for poets and painters. They'd wander around at dawn, sketching crumbling towers, and pretending to feel the ghosts of history breathing down their necks. It was the era of Romanticism, which basically means everyone wanted to feel sad and majestic at the same time. And castles were perfect for that. Cold, beautiful, slightly broken, like the world's first Gothic aesthetic filter. Even monarchs got nostalgic. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert famously built Balmoral Castle, not an actual medieval fortress, but a 19th century fantasy version. It had all the turrets and stonework, but none of the inconvenient medieval smells. It's basically what you'd get if an architect binge-watched Game of Thrones and then said, let's make this cozy. Then there's Neuschwanstein in Germany, the castle that looks too dreamy to be real. King Ludwig II built it in the late 1800s, long after anyone needed a fortress. He just wanted something out of a fairy tale. He filled it with swans, murals, and theatrical lighting, the medieval mood board of his dreams. He never got to finish it, but Walt Disney saw it decades later and thought, yeah, that'll do nicely. So if you've ever stood in front of a Disney castle, in a way you've been standing inside the ghost of Ludwig's lonely fantasy. But castles aren't just relics. They're reminders of something deeper, humanity's obsession with control. Back then, walls meant safety. Now, we build digital walls instead. Firewalls, passwords, security systems, same need, just fewer moats. We still crave the feeling of shutting the drawbridge and saying, I'm safe in here. And yet, no matter how advanced we get, we still visit these ruins. We pay money to walk through crumbling stone corridors, to look out from towers that no longer guard anything. We imagine knights, queens, and torches flickering in the dark, because somewhere inside, we missed the simplicity of a world where power had a physical shape, even if that shape was a drafty grey wall. So maybe that's why castles never really left us. They became myths we carry forward into books, films, and bedtime stories. They remind us that even empires, no matter how grand, eventually crumble into silence. And yet, that silence is kind of peaceful. It's the sound of history finally exhaling. So as you drift off tonight, picture it, a moonlit castle standing alone on a hill. The torches are out, the gates are closed, the courtyard is empty. Only the wind moves through the arrow slits, whispering through time. The stone doesn't remember names, but it remembers warmth, footsteps, and laughter. And maybe, in a quiet way, it remembers you too. Good night, traveler. Rest well within your modern walls. Tomorrow, history will still be waiting, patient, dusty, and slightly sarcastic, just where we left it.